So, welcome to part 3 of chapter 7. I've split part 3 up into two parts. Part 3.1's what we're going to look at here, and it's kind of a recap in the push for democracy. 3.2 will be talking about the rebellions and the aftermath of that. So, quick recap of the Great Migration. So, hundreds of thousands of people immigrated to British North America from Great Britain. So, British North America was what was left over in North America after the American Revolution. So it's PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Upper and Lower Canada. Those hundreds of thousands of people made a big difference to life in British North America. You've seen this graph before. It's from your textbook on page 203. What we kind of see in particular is this change up here. Before the Great Migration, Lower Canada, largest population by a lot. And by the time the Great Migration's done, all of a sudden Upper Canada has more people. The other thing to notice around 1840, when a whole lot of stuff was going down in this time frame, is that if you add up all these ones down here, so you're looking at Upper Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Newfoundland, you add up all those ones down here, they pretty much take you to now there being more English-speaking people in British North America. The Francophones were a little bit nervous about this. Just as a little introduction or an idea of what life was like in Upper Canada, I've shared this link with you in the notes page or the links page. This is a series or part of a series from the National Film Board. It's talking about life in Upper Canada. It's definitely not mandatory for you guys to watch. It just gives you a sense of what life was like in Upper Canada and how different it was from life in England, which will take us to the next slide here, is a direct comparison that you guys will have an assignment in regards to. So this cartoon, you guys are going to analyze this, make some notes on it, whatever. Check for the attached assignment in Google Classroom. So this is a cartoon that was published in England in the 1840s. And it was basically almost like an advertisement showing that life was better in Canada. So we have at home and abroad, right? At home was Great Britain, down here at the bottom. If the Google thing gets out of the way, it's not going to let me. So this is what life was like in Great Britain. This is what they're saying life was like in Canada. Okay, so we can see that these life looks kind of miserable out here. This is the needlewoman. A needlewoman, like a seamstress, like a tailor, right? Someone that sews things for a living. So if you look at home in Great Britain, not a lot going on for her, right? This guy here is like, hey, get out of here, and you see the poor waif of a starving child here. But you go to Canada, all of a sudden, the same woman, in theory, she's healthy, got 2 young children, a husband that's providing lots of food hanging from the ceiling, a nice roof over her head, big long dress, lots of good stuff. So this is an advertisement basically saying that comparing your life in Canada or abroad, right, in the British North America compared to life in England, it was a lot better. So this is propaganda. This is the people trying to convince you that life was better in Canada and that you should make the trip, take that big step and make the trip across to Canada. Okay, so this is kind of what was going on in the New World at the time. So the push for democracy, because of all these people arriving from England, all these newcomers, a whole lot of them turned into what we call reformers, and they wanted change. Obviously, what did they want? They wanted democracy, hence the title there. The reformers basically wanted to be treated like adults. The government in the New World, in British North America, was not set up to give them a say, unless you were the wealthy. And so the reformers basically said, just let us make some decisions. Let's have the authority, the ability to make decisions that affect our lives. They saw what had happened in the United States with their revolution. They knew what existed in Great Britain. There was a move towards some democracy in Great Britain. but they wanted that authority, that ability to make the decisions that affected their own lives in British North America. So the reformers wanted to change the government that existed in British North America. What they had was here on the left-hand side, the colonial government. So this is what actually existed in British North America at the time. The governor was appointed by Great Britain, and he was in charge of defense and gave direction to the council. And by gave direction to the councils, he controlled what the council did. Now, the councils were appointed and advised by the governor. So if the governor didn't like what they were doing, he appointed other ones. And these are the guys that ran the colony. There was an assembly that was elected by the voters, but the assembly only advised the councils. They would, like, hey guys, how about you try this? Or here's a good idea. They gave advice. The council didn't have to listen to the assembly. They only got advice from the assembly. And then the voters. The voters were generally male property owners. You had to own property to vote. You had to be of a certain age. I think it was 21, might have been 25. Kind of irrelevant right now. Or if you were a woman and whose husband owned property and was eligible to vote, and he died, and you still own the property, you were allowed to vote. So women were allowed to vote in Canada before they got the suffrage in the early 1900s if they were a widow of a property owner. The government that the reformers wanted was considerably different. Same kind of setup in terms of a governor, council, assembly, and voters. But in this one, the governor was still appointed by Britain and was in charge of defense and those types of things. But he only represented Britain and could no longer appoint or override the decisions of the council. Before that, again, the governor wanted to do something that the council didn't. Kind of had like veto power. The councils now were elected by the assembly. So I'm going to skip down to the assembly. The assembly elected the voters, or is elected by the voters, and those elected representatives picked the council to kind of run the day-to-day business. It'd be like the cabinet in today's government. So now the council was elected by the assembly. If the council wasn't doing what the assembly wanted, the assembly would choose new councillors. And ultimately, the assembly was picked by the voters. And like we have in our democracy today, a representative democracy, if we don't like what our elected officials are doing, we can vote them out next time. Who got to vote? Not a lot different. Male property owners, widows, etc. But now, ultimately, all the way up to the councils were elected by the people. So this is a big, big change, and this is what they wanted. So the situation in Lower Canada, this is what led up to it. The English, which was called the Chateau Clique, held the power in those appointed councils. So even though it was a French-speaking colony, the English held the power. The Canadian, and anytime we see the word Canadian, we're talking about the French-speaking people, the Francophones, they held the power in the elected assembly. But remember, the elected assembly really had no control over the council. So the councils could do what they wanted. And so you had the Canadian political parties. They wanted that democracy. Fighting would sometimes break out between the voters, the French and the English voters. Literally, you'd go in to vote and there'd be a fight outside because it wasn't a secret ballot. You would go in and write down who you're voting for, and people would try to intimidate you. And then you had the cholera epidemic that we talked about, killing all these Canadians, a bunch of Francophones thinking the English are doing this on purpose. And then years of crop failures. The French farmers were starving. And so everybody was getting quite upset. Unless you're the English merchants in control, people were upset in Lower Canada. In Upper Canada, not a lot different, right? The power struggle between the appointed and elected, appointed council, elected assembly, the wealthy Canadian families. There was some English and some Canadian, like French families that had moved in there, were called the Family Compact. They held the power in those councils. And a reform party was started up. It was made up of U.S. immigrants, the ones that came maybe after the War of 1812, those loyalists that wanted independence from Britain. They wanted to create what's called a republic. I'll touch base on that in a bit. So in 1836, the governor of Upper Canada kind of interfered with the election, made sure that the Reform Party lost, and that was kind of that last straw. And again, years of crop failure drove many Canadian farmers to starvation. And this should be Canadian with an A, not with the E on that one. That's the oops typo on that I'll fix in your actual notes. Who were their leaders? There were three main leaders in the push for independence. Louis Joseph Papineau, William Lyon Mackenzie, and Joseph Howe. Papineau was from Lower Canada. He led the group that was called Les Patriotes, and he wanted equality for the Canadian. He also called on people to boycott English products, not buy them. William Lyon Mackenzie from Upper Canada, he had a newspaper, so he used that newspaper to air his voice and demand change. He wanted what was called a Republican democracy. Republican means you don't have a king or a queen. You'd have a president or something similar to that, but no tie to the monarchy. And then Joseph Howe in Nova Scotia also had a newspaper to demand change, used it to say, this is what we should do to try and convince people. But he wanted to remain loyal to Britain, but still have a democracy. So he still wanted to retain the monarchy. Mackenzie wanted to get rid of the monarchy. Papineau just wanted some equality. So that's the end of this part. Keep it nice and short, hopefully. And then up next, we'll talk about the rebellion.